Good evening, everybody. My interest in Mission Espada started a couple of years before I became a CPG. I was on a nighttime bike ride with several friends. We were out at Mission Espada about 9 o'clock at night, and a car pulls up, kind of an older car, and out of it gets a guy dressed in full army fatigues and combat boots. Well, I was a little concerned because we're out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, but it turned out that it was Brother Jerome, one of the Franciscan friars who took care of Mission Espada. He was responsible back in those days for the gardens, and they had beautiful gardens and a lot of cats. Anyway, he was so kind, and he offered to let us go inside and take a look at and talk a little about the history of the inside like that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. This doesn't have to do with the mysteries, but up on the altar, you see three statues. You see Jesus over here, and if you look closely, you can see kind of crinkles in his arm. Well, he walks up there and bends the arms of this statue. And to the best of my abilities, it appears that it's maybe 200 years old, but it still articulates like that. Quite amazing. In the middle, you have St. Francis. When he was kind of rediscovered at the first part of the 1900s, they pulled him out. He was, his frock was brown. When they started doing some cleaning, they noticed that there was gold underneath, and it turned out there was gold leaf. So they were able to restore that. Now over here is Dolores, or Our Lady of Sorrows. And I'm a little hesitant in front of this many people to admit that I have peeked under the skirt of the Virgin Mary. When Brother Jerome walks over there and grabs the hem of her dress, I was a little concerned, but he pulled it up to show that there's scaffolding underneath. It's designed to be carried on a shoulder processional like that. So as we were leaving, he locks the door, walks a few steps, turns around and points to the arch. And he said, there are people who think that that is not the original design of the arch. Well, I hadn't thought of that. I'd always been told it was a Moorish arch, and it looked pretty Moorish to me. Here's several examples of that kind of arch. It's called a Herradura arch, or that Moorish arch like that. And that's a pretty convincing version of it right there. I didn't have any trouble with that. But it got me to thinking and looking and asking questions. So I did this. It's a magnetic board. It's all mounted on foam board with an actual picture. So let's strip a few things away and see what we get. When you look at it like this, it is kind of questionable. But before we address what is going on there, I thought it'd be nice to fill in a little background information. 1740, a young Mason named Antonio Tello came to San Antonio. He was hired by the College of Querétaro, the Apostolic College, to come here and build stone churches at the missions that they ran. That's all of them except for San Jose. He was he seemed to get a lot done. He came here, he had churches started at all four of the missions. He's even credited with building the aqueduct. So he had foundations at all the missions, and at Espada particularly, he had the big foundations of a large church. And when I say large church, I'm talking about the size of Valero, Alamo, or Concepcion, a large church. And they were in the ground, 4 foot wide, 4 foot deep, very heavy duty foundations. Walls had started to come up, and he had started the sacristy, which is what we consider the church now. But the sacristy had started to be built. Also in 1744, Antonio Teo was having an affair with a young woman named Rosa Guerra. And it gets a little convoluted, so I made a little lover's triangle to try to help keep it straight. Antonio Teo was having an affair with Rosa Guerra. Rosa Guerra was married to Mateus Trevino. Mateus Trevino had been away on a trip to Mexico. He came back, he discovered the affair, he told his wife, forgave his wife, but told Teo to never have anything to do with her again. Several days later, he told Trevino how sorry he was. He wanted to give him a gift, something to show how sorry he was. And he had a young calf he wanted to give him. So he meets Trevino about dusk. They walk out towards the corral. When he gets into the woods, he pulls a pistol out, shoots Trevino in the side, point blank, and beats him over the head with the pistol and leaves him for dead. Well, unfortunately for Teo, Trevino did not die immediately. He was able to drag himself in. He was able to get to a friend's house. They called the alcalde, the judge. The judge came, the scribe came, and thus began a very interesting murder investigation that was carefully written down, that was carefully stored away, and was carefully translated. And so we know everything about this. It's a very interesting deal. Anyway, at the end, they determined that he had indeed killed Trevino, and that when they went to arrest him, he was gone. He was nowhere to be found. Well, the fallout from that immediately was that all the construction at all the churches ground to a halt. Eventually, the church at Concepcion was finished, probably because it was considered the headquarters of the Querétaro efforts in this area. But none of the other ones were completed like that. At Espada, the friars went on and finished the sacristy right after he left. The dimensions on that, we know from an inventory, were 15.5 feet wide by 38 feet long, like that. They ended up building it up and putting the top on it. In the process of building it up, they did something that made a difference down the line. So I'm going to introduce you to several vocabulary words here. Corbel is one of them. A corbel is a beam that's set across a church so that the choir loft can sit on it. It's usually in the back of the church. So you have these big 4-foot thick walls. They'll build it up to a certain point, put these big beams in there, build it up. So you have this thing set into these masonry like that. The other word we're going to talk about here in a minute is transepts, and probably you've heard that before or you know it. That's the little side things on here that that make it look like a cross like that. Anyway, so they finished that part, and that served as their church for almost 40 years. There were other efforts. They never ever built the big church that was planned to be attached to that. There was another church. If you go to Espada and you walk towards the restrooms from the church, you'll see a foundation in the ground there. That was an attempt at turning another building into a church, and it was a failure. It was going to collapse, so they took it apart. So anyway, for almost 40 years, that served as their church. It wasn't until the late 1700s, 1785-ish, that a man named Antonio Salazar came to and expanded the church out, did all the work that basically is what you see today. He expanded it out from 38 feet to 60 feet. He built the Espadana, the bell tower that's on the front, and he put the door in. Now, one thing we knew from the beginning was that Teo, before he left, he had carved the stones for the door. They're called voussoirs, the term that they use for the individual stones. We know that those were carved and were not ever used, probably put in storage. So the speculation is that when Salazar decided to build the doorway, he was able to utilize the stones that Teo had done. So let's back up a little bit. Let's go backwards. Let's see if we can figure out what the arch that Teo built would have looked like. So over the years, there's been multiple suggestions. One of the early ones, a guy named Eugene George, who was like the mission guy back in the 60s and 70s, had this theory that it was there were these missing wedge parts, and if you did it, it would be this beautiful Herradura arch like that. The best solution was probably the simplest, and that's that the bottom two stones, voussoirs, were simply swapped and rotated. So watch what happens when we do that. That's pretty convincing, huh? So now, all of a sudden, instead of a disjointedness to it, we have a semicircular or Roman arch. The Romans were in Spain for 700 years, and you see a lot of Roman arches there and in Mexico. So that makes sense that it would be that. The groove lines up, everything lines up. The only catch is that there's this interesting design underneath there. Most Roman arches are just symmetrical like that. This has this interesting design in it. It was one of those things that I looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, and I thought, man, that just looks really familiar, but I can't decide. I couldn't figure out what it was. I was in bed one night, laying in bed, and boom, the light bulb goes off. It's the bottom half of a barbed quatrefoil. Now, a quatrefoil, I left the lines on here so you can see, it is drawn with a compass, and it's 4 circles that overlap. Quatrefoil means 4 leaves. A barbed quatrefoil is a variation where a square is superimposed over it like that. So the quatrefoil, I was able to find the earliest version of that was in Constantinople. I saw a church building that was built back in the 400 ADs that had a quatrefoil design to it like that. The quatrefoil and the barbed quatrefoil have been used over the centuries, Gothic and on up, and it is a very Christian symbol like that. So is this a Moorish arch? No, I don't think so. But anyway, I thought it would be interesting to find out where this design came from. And of course, my first thought was Spain, that, the Masons had seen it in Spain and brought it with them. Well, I got on Google and started doing image searches. And I searched all over the big cities, and then I started the smaller cities, the southern cities, and I never found an arch that had this particular design in it, the barbed quatrefoil like that. Maybe it was Moorish. So I looked in the mosques that were down in the lower portion of Spain, North Africa, even over into the Middle East, nothing. Rome, I didn't find it. It was not until I started looking in Mexico that I located that arch. And to date, I've located about 20 different ones, and here are some examples. These 3 are in Mexico City proper, Coyoacan, but I found them in San Luis Potosi and in Puebla, a lot of different places. And this is of interest. Up here is that is at Tepeyac Hill. That is where the Virgin of Guadalupe made her appearance to Juan Diego. So the range of these that I was able to figure out was anywhere from 1690 up to about 1780. And as a matter of fact, we even have examples of it right here in San Antonio. Now up here, that is Mission San Jose, and I didn't even recognize that one. It's so well camouflaged with all the other stuff, but if you look closely, it is a barbed quatrefoil arch. Now the other one down here is, this is the staircase up to the Father President's residence, and you see the barbed quatrefoil arch like that. So it's very likely that Antonio Teo saw that arch, or maybe even worked on a church that had that arch and brought the idea with him like that. So we're going to run with that anyway. So I wanted to figure out what maybe the arch looked like. So I thought, well, he had done the same thing at Concepcion. He probably had done the stones for the arch at Concepcion, and possibly he used the same dimensions, which I don't think is unusual. I think it would probably make sense for them to reuse deals. So I went to Concepcion and I took careful measurements. The distance from the ground to the inner part of the arch, this is Concepcion, it has a circle drawn, but it's squared off like that, is a little over 9 feet. The distance between the two side pillars like that is 6 feet, and the pillar itself that supports the arch is right at 6 feet. Of course, these were all in varas to begin with, but that's how it measures out. Well, a good start to that analogy is that when you unfold this arch, this is all scale, the distance between here and here is 6 feet, which is exactly the same as it is at Concepcion. So let's do something here. Let's go ahead and move it up to that higher level. And again, it was a big church, so probably it was going to have a big door on it like that. So we move it up to that 9 foot, and with the help of my neighbor, Kent Rush, who may or may not be here on this, I was able to Photoshop several columns to kind of demonstrate what it might have looked like. So when you do that, when you set this to the right height, the same as Concepcion, and you put the columns in, the columns are 6 feet high, which is exactly the same as Concepcion. So that's pretty clear to me that that's probably what it looked like. It's not that critical. It might have been a little shorter or a little taller, but the fact that it was a big, full arch, similar to what you see at Concepcion, is probably the case like that. Now comes the interesting part. How did it end up where it was? Why was it so much smaller? What were the reasons for that? Well, of course, we don't really know. Antonio Salazar didn't leave notes or anything, but we can make speculation on what happened there. One, remember we talked about the choir loft. It had this big beam there that he probably didn't want to fool with. He didn't want to cut that out to make a big door like that. So the easiest thing would have been to drop the height of the door below the choir loft. So let's look at that. Right there. And in order to do that, if they were going to do this, they would have had to shorten those side pillars. And indeed, by looking closely, you can see that's exactly what probably happened there. Here, possibly they cut it wrong or something and had to fill in with brick, but it's been modified. The other pillar, you can see where the break is, same place, but for some reason they didn't have to do that. So that would account for getting it underneath the choir loft like that. Could have left it just like this. Maybe there's several reasons he didn't. One, it's kind of a squatty looking arch. It's not a real aesthetic looking arch like that. The other factor, and probably more importantly, was this wall right here was 4 feet thick. He was going to have to bust through a 4 foot thick wall. Now, when they build a church, the wall goes up in conjunction with the door. So that's not a big deal. You just build around it and keep going. But he was going to have to bust out a big, heavy amount of 4 foot thick wall like that. My guess is that he laid these stones out, the voussoirs, and came up with a very clever solution to his problem. By simply doing what we talked about, rotating and putting those back. Now it goes from being 6 feet across to 3 foot 9 inches across, much smaller. And one of the things that Brother Jerome said that I thought was interesting is that this is a problem for funerals, because you can't get a coffin through with while the pallbearers are holding it on the side. So this is my solution to the mystery of the door at Espada. And that is that it started life as a different shape arch, but that it was very cleverly manipulated to create the appropriate size and everything that we have here. Now, the next thing, I don't have any doubt about this. I think this is pretty clear to me that that's the case. The next thing, though, is a little more interesting, or not a little more interesting, a little kind of a different thing. It's where that original church was. So one of the things we know is that as a sacristy, it was going to butt up against the transept, and there was a door that would lead into here. And as a matter of fact, if you look closely at the facade of Espada, you can see that offset door that's been filled in. So anyway, where was that church? One of my go-to authors on the history of the archaeology and architecture of the missions is named James Ivey. He wrote a book called Of Various Magnificence, and it is awesome. He was the park archaeologist for a long time, and he's a very thoughtful guy and came up with some really interesting ideas, translations and stuff that he did. So his idea was that the footprint of that church would have looked very much like the Alamo. So I made a scale model of the area that we're talking about right here. So we have, here's the church. Here's the church that we have now, the original sacristy here, Salazar's addition here. There's a wall, kind of a short wall around here. Espada Road comes up here, turns the corner, and you drive into the parking lot. 410's out here. So this is what it looks like now. Ivy suggests that the big church probably had a similar cross-section to the Alamo, which again, we talk about how that door was similar. Why create new dimensions every time you do it? So one thing that we have that's very amazing is we have blueprints of the missions. This was done much later, of course, but it's part of a project called HABS, Historical American Building Survey. And they would go around and measure the buildings. All of our missions have this, and basically create blueprints for if you were going to build them, I guess. So I was able to use this drawing to do very accurate footprint models of the church. Here. So here is a model of the Alamo, and if you'll remember, the outbuildings are on the left side. You have the sacristy here, the monk's burial chamber here, but everything else, you know, is like that with the transepts and all. So let's see how that fits on. So pretty okay, kind of lines up with some of the stuff. The low wall that's here is pretty much where the nave of the church would have been. Up here is another low wall. So possibly those were foundation walls that were reused. But the most amazing part of this is that we talked about how the original sacristy was 38 feet long. Well, the distance from the bell chapel to the transept on the Alamo is 38 feet. So our sacristy, this sacristy would have fit perfectly right in there. It's the same height. So probably he was on the right track like that, to think it was similar. Now, one thing he talks about is when Salazar came, he didn't particularly have a lot of time to do it, and that's probably why he wanted to reuse the door. That would simplify things quite a bit. But he also speculated that he used existing parts of the foundation to complete the length of it. So to take that into account, I created another version closer to what I think the original would have looked like. It's all very similar to the outline of the Alamo, except that the bell tower is larger. So now the wall of the sacristy comes all the way down. This is the south, well, I don't remember which wall, let's see what it is, south wall of the sacristy comes all the way down and over, which makes more sense than if they would come down and jog over and come down like that. So if this is the case, if this is indeed the case, Salazar would have been able to just come down, build the walls up here, and tear that out, and he would have had the church like that. So this is my suggestion of what the original church might have looked like. Really very similar to the Alamo, large, big church. And I can't help but think that if Antonio Teo had been a better boy, we might have some real magnificent churches here instead of what, you know, the leftovers of what we have like that. So now the other interesting thing is that this big church, the alignment of it is almost exactly the same as Concepcion. So you know how we have the illumination at Concepcion. If you put the window in the right position here, you could have had exactly the same illumination on the same day. So anyway, this is, to me, that was the second mystery. Now a good question is, why haven't they looked for foundations or found any? They haven't. I've read a lot of the archaeological reports, and there's really nothing. They have not ever dug in places where the foundations will be. The other thing is that it was not uncommon for them to dig up foundations that were not being used and recycle those rocks. Jake Ivey said they did that at Mission Concepcion on the walls there, that they found trenches where they would dig them out, take the rocks. So there's a good chance that all of these, if these foundations are indeed were there, that they're gone. Maybe the only ones that are left are the ones underneath the original church. The other interesting thing that this lends itself to is the wall right now is right here, right at the base of, here, let's see if I can bring it up, right at the base of where the church is. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't have your exit right onto a wall. So it's speculated that if indeed this is the case, that the mission compound was west of where it is now, or down west from here, across the street from where it is now. And that when they decided to just go with the sacristy, they went with they moved the compound up. That's speculation. All of this is speculation. When I take my customers to Espada, I have a little model that I show the arch. When it comes to the church, I'm not very specific. I just tell them that it's over here, probably where these walls are kind of lined up over here, and that it's about the size of the Alamo. I think that's sufficient like that. So those are two of the mysteries that I was very interested in, and those are my solutions to it. So the other things I have to say is, don't believe that all mission history is done. It's been discovered, it's over. Not true. There's so many things that are still out there, so many things that have been said over the years that people just accept them, that are not necessarily true. So don't ever hesitate to check into something, to really look into history. It's never over like that. Okay, thanks guys, I enjoyed it.